3 months divorced, 4 months pregnant. Do the math. Mafia kingpin Dante severed his marriage with a single signature to keep Alina safe. But when his right-hand man calls with an unsafe location, Dante discovers she is unconscious, destitute, and carrying his child. His protection details were bought off by outside accounts. Now the most dangerous man in the city realizes he has been played.
You and I have seen men play the cold boss, but Dante Morti is on a completely different level of broken. Picture his boardroom. It is a physical reflection of his guarded soul. The walls swallow sound, blocking out the screaming city to create a sterile vacuum ruled by pure ego. He sits there, weaponizing silence, no yelling, just suffocating dread crushing his crew. A captain sweats bullets, stammering through a report, while Dante traces his glass with dead eyes. The terrifying emptiness radiating off him is heavy, but it leaves us with a quiet truth tonight. Building impenetrable walls to block out the pain of the world never makes you invincible. It just means you end up locking yourself inside a cold fortress, trapped forever with your own ghosts. Look at the hollow core of this man. Just 3 months ago, Dante dumped his wife, Alina, with the exact same dead energy he uses to run his empire. One quick signature, and she was cut from his life like a surgical strike. He convinced himself it was just a business move, hiding his fear of connection behind toxic stoicism. But karma always collects its debts. While his captain talks, that suffocating silence is violently shattered. A harsh buzz from his phone cuts the tension, and every hardened thug in the room freezes. The irony here rings so loud it actually hurts. You can spend your entire life building a flawless illusion of absolute control, only for one tiny mechanical sound to completely rip the floor right out from underneath you. It proves that control is always a fragile lie. The only man allowed to break the blackout rule is his right hand, Marco. Watch Dante's body language here. He does not even grab the phone right away. He just lets it buzz, keeping a pure predator stare locked onto his captain until the poor guy totally crumbles. Once the room is dead quiet, Dante picks up the device like a man who thinks he owns time itself. He drops one freezing, flat word. Yes, but on the other end of the line, Marco hesitates. It is this thick, agonizing, dead air that makes your stomach drop. It serves as a chilling reminder of how life actually works, a lesson we all learn eventually. The exact moment before your entire universe falls apart is rarely announced by a massive explosion. The absolute worst tragedies usually kick off with nothing more than a quiet, completely breathless pause. We all know the toughest masks hide the most fragile egos. Marco's silence is the hammer that smashes Dante's weak spot. When Marco finally speaks, his voice is so rough it makes Dante's knuckles twitch. We found her. Those 3 words instantly bypass every iron wall Dante ever built. Watch his face. The untouchable boss energy completely drains out of his eyes. Then Marco drops the heavy truth. Your ex-wife, she is pregnant. 4 months. At those exact words, Dante literally stops breathing. His entire empire just evaporates. 4 months. The cold math hits his brain like a speeding train. It is a brutal, agonizing wake-up call. It proves to all of us that no amount of ruthless cash or street power can ever shield you from the irreversible consequences of your own past choices. That timeline violently rips away his fake reality. It drags his brain straight back to that one night he actually let his guard down. The night he hated himself for, treating real love like it was a fatal disease. He ran away before sunrise, using those divorce papers like a bandage to stop his own heart from bleeding out. Then Marco delivers the knockout punch over the line. She is unconscious. It brings up a painful truth we all must face eventually. You can never outrun your own humanity, no matter how deep you try to bury it. Watch the camera frame carefully. You can actually see Dante's mind completely fry. To his terrified crew, he just stands up. But the harsh scrape of his wooden chair is the deafening sound of a fake king completely losing his grip on the empire he traded his soul to build. Stick with me here, because the heavy air inside that boardroom is completely paralyzed. Dante drops a hoarse whisper asking for the address. When his brain maps it to the worst slum in the city, he completely short-circuits. He had wired her millions, genuinely believing that throwing cash at the problem would magically erase their ruined relationship. His massive ego never factored in the brutal emotional crash Elena would endure. Like a wounded bird kicked out of a golden cage, she spiraled straight into the freezing gutter. Why is she out there alone, his god? Complex fractures in real time. It is a harsh reminder for all of us tonight. Cash might buy you temporary silence, but it never buys actual absolution. Boss. Marco pleads over the phone, his usually dead voice suddenly spiking with pure panic. We need to move right now. Dante kills the call. You and I really need to unpack this insane shift. He reaches for his custom coat, trying to look smooth, but look closely at his hands. They are visibly shaking. His jaw is locked so tight it looks like his teeth might shatter. That untouchable mob boss aesthetic is turning into absolute dust right before our eyes. Meeting is over, he barks. There is no strategy anymore. In 1 second flat, the coldest kingpin in the city devolves into a completely terrified father. When one clueless captain dares to bring up the docks, Dante's quiet order to handle it sounds like a literal death threat. He storms out radiating absolute chaos. It just goes to show a timeless truth. Real love, even when you try to bury it alive, will always violently tear its way back up to the surface. Follow the camera tracking Dante down that dark hallway. Armed guards stiffen up instantly, sensing his chaotic energy. He tries so hard to project absolute control, but watch what happens the second the elevator doors close. He completely breaks. He slumps against the cold mirror, haunted by the memory of Elena standing at the door 4 months ago. She had one tiny suitcase, looking back, silently begging him to stop her, and he just stood there. He disguised his emotional cowardice as harsh gangster logic, telling himself that love was a liability. The deep tragedy of human nature is that we constantly feed ourselves empty lies just to avoid facing our deepest fears. Stepping out into the freezing night air, his massive empire means absolutely zero to a man rapidly losing his mind. The outside world still totally bows down to his money. Marco already has the black sedan idling on the curb. Dante slides into the back seat, and the armored door seals shut, sounding exactly like a bank vault locking him in. The engine roars and tires scream on the wet street, but Dante is completely checked out. He stares blankly through the tinted glass, blind to the blurry city lights flashing by. All his brain can picture is Elena, freezing on the dirty pavement, trying to protect a tiny life he did not even know existed. For a guy who spends his entire life playing God, there is no hell worse than absolute powerlessness. A crushing wave of panic finally sinks its claws into his chest. But the sickest twist of this situation is that his ex-wife has already been trapped in that exact same terrifying nightmare for months. Let us shift the lens over to Elena. The raw reality of her collapse is completely brutal. Her bare knees slam against the freezing concrete, sending a sharp shock of pain up her spine. The absolute apathy of this city is what really breaks your heart. Blinding headlights cut through the fog, and faceless people step right over her like she is completely invisible. That terrifying isolation is the heaviest burden. But even as she is literally blacking out in the cold, an intense maternal instinct overrides her failing body. She curls up tight, pressing shaking, dirty hands over her stomach to protect the only pure thing she has left. She never deserved to hit rock bottom like this. It highlights a very bitter truth we all have to learn. Life rarely ever stops to ask for your permission before it completely falls to pieces. Lying on that freezing sidewalk, fragments of her old life flash through her head like broken glass. She remembers the penthouse perfectly, the cold flecks of those marble floors, the suffocating quiet of crazy wealth, the expensive smell of Dante's cologne. She let herself believe that Golden Cage was her forever home. Trusting a mob boss was a beautiful but fatal mistake. When the breakup dropped, there was zero emotional closure. It was a straight-up execution of her heart. That divorce hit her like a heavy guillotine, fast, quiet, and completely final. His lawyers handed her a folder without looking her in the eye, erasing her from his kingdom by sunset. There is a painful life lesson hidden deep in her scars tonight. Handing over your entire sense of security to another human being is hands down the most dangerous gamble you will ever make. You and I have seen this tragic downfall play out way too many times before. Picture her standing in the freezing rain, clutching that thin manila envelope. Her entire identity got wiped out with a single pen stroke. She called his private number until her phone battery died, begging for just a little help. But she only got dead air, blocked by the exact same goons he pays to forget her name. She naively thought the monster she fell in love with would soften up. By the time the absolute horror of her situation set in, it was entirely too late. The joke of a payout he gave her instantly dried up. The shady landlords and massive hospital bills devoured her cash, leaving her starving in the cold. It is genuinely terrifying how fast a comfortable life of luxury can dissolve into a desperate street fight just to survive the night. Welcome back to The Late Shift. You and I are going to unpack what happens when a soul is pushed to the absolute edge of survival. Picture Elena trading the glittering chains of her past for crumbled bills. First to go were the diamonds, then the silk. With every transaction, she strips away the hollow identity Dante forced on her. The real agony isn't the loss of wealth. It is the terrifying realization that her safety net was always a lie. She is entirely alone out there on the freezing pavement, carrying a child she refuses to let go of. The dizzy spells started weeks ago, but she pushed them down. Here is a quiet truth for tonight, when you are fighting a desperate battle just to see tomorrow. Your mind will silence the loudest alarms your body rings. The grim reality of her daily grind is brutal. Elena drags herself through crushing shifts at a roadside diner until her legs feel like lead. When she finally stumbles, the manager just sees a liability and slashes her hours without a second thought. Just like that, her tiny lifeline of income vanishes. A warm meal becomes an impossible luxury. She starves, ignoring the violent hunger gnawing at her ribs, all to keep the fragile pulse inside her alive. It is a sickening contrast to the ironclad protection Dante once swore to give her. When powerful men treat human lives like disposable chess pieces, the innocent always bleed the most. It leaves us with this lesson. True strength isn't found in how fiercely you dominate others, but in how deeply you care for them. We all know what happens when the tank runs entirely dry. The body just quits. Elena is pushed to the ragged edge of physical collapse, eating nothing but half a discarded sandwich in over 24 hours. The dark street begins to spin wildly. Those dull yellow street lamps smear into vicious streaks of light. Her hands shake violently as she reaches for the freezing metal of a bench, but her fingers slip. Her last ounce of strength evaporates into the winter air. She hits the frozen concrete hard, but the impact feels miles away. It is a merciful detachment from the agony of her reality. We eventually learn this the hard way. When the world strips away everything you have left, rock bottom often offers a strange, tragic peace in the dead silence. Every single breath turns into a desperate, burning fight for air. Right at this brutal breaking point, her mind pulls a tragic trick. It retreats straight back to the man who broke her. She doesn't see the cold mob boss who cast her aside. Instead, she clings tightly to the warm ghost of the man from their earliest days. It is the devastating reality of a broken heart. We often hold on to the ghost of the person who ruined us, just to feel a fleeting second of safety. His name slips through her cracked lips, Dante. Barely a whisper, yet heavy with an ocean of unspoken grief. Her freezing fingers instinctively curl over her stomach, shielding the life inside. "I am trying," she whispers to the empty street. It reveals a heavy truth. Even in our absolute darkest hours, the primal instinct to protect the innocent is what keeps us fighting. "I am really trying." She breathes out, her voice shatters as her body finally surrenders to the exhaustion she fought off for weeks. The winter chill pierces right through her thin coat, swallowing her still form as the world fades to black. But right before the darkness drags her under, a fragile flutter against her palm pulls her back. A tiny heartbeat. She is not fighting alone. Just as she slips away, the shadows shift. A heavy black sedan turns onto the dead street, moving with the quiet aggression of an apex predator. The headlights slice through the gloom, exposing the frozen pavement. The car radiates a suffocating dominance, chewing up the empty road. Life teaches us all a harsh lesson here. The past never truly stays buried. It always will racing back to find us when we are at our absolute most vulnerable. Inside the suffocating silence of that car, Dante sits completely motionless. He doesn't need to speak to control the oxygen in the space. The sheer weight of his presence wraps around his men like a tightened noose. Up front, Marco grips the wheel with a locked jaw, his eyes frantically scanning the dark alleys. Up ahead, Marco mutters, pointing toward a broken bus stop. He keeps his voice flat, terrified that a single wrong syllable might ignite the ticking bomb sitting in the back seat. The heavy car glides to a stop, but Dante is already moving. He throws the door open with a violent force that shatters the dead quiet of the freezing winter night. It is a harsh lesson in pride for all of us. The massive walls we build to project untouchable power usually just end up trapping us inside our own desperate panic. The biting wind hits him instantly, but Dante doesn't even feel the ice. His dark eyes lock onto the small broken figure on the pavement, and his vision tunnels until nothing else exists. You and I need to pause right here and look at the sheer denial playing out in his head. For a split second, his arrogant brain, flat out, rejects the reality of what he is seeing. He tries to tell himself she is safe under his massive web of surveillance, but that fragile lie shatters the second his expensive leather shoes hit the pavement beside her. "Elena," he whispers. The word falls out of his chest, entirely stripping away the untouchable mask of the mob boss. We so often blind ourselves with the illusion of total control, only waking up to the horrible truth when our mistakes are lying broken right at our very feet. She is curled tightly on her side, her trembling hand locked fiercely over her stomach. Even as her frail body completely shuts down, the fierce instinct of a mother protecting her child keeps her anchored. Dante slams onto his knees right there, dragging his pristine coat through the filthy slush of the street. For a man utterly obsessed with his feared image, this sudden collapse reveals everything. The only things that exist now are the terrifying shallowness of her breath and the ghostly white color of her skin. "Christo," he breathes out. It is a raw, entirely unfiltered sound of pure terror. His shaking fingers reach out, brushing against the icy skin of her hollow cheek. Life violently humbles us, proving that all the status in the world means absolutely nothing when the people we love are slipping away. Listen closely, because this isn't just the winter cold taking its toll. This is the brutal, undeniable cost of his total neglect. It is the tragic decay of a woman deprived of basic survival. Acting on raw, panicked instinct, Dante's shaking hands brush the dirty hair from her face, exposing the sharp, hollowed-out bones of her cheeks. Seeing her this broken violently destroys the perfect memory he kept locked in his head. "Boss," Marco calls out softly from the shadows. "We have to go. She has been out here way too long." Dante doesn't even hear the words. His dark gaze drops lower, locking on to the undeniable curve hidden beneath her worn-out sweater. It shows us a difficult truth. Avoiding your responsibilities never actually protects anyone. It only creates much deeper wounds that we eventually have to face head-on. In that single heartbeat, Dante's entire universe completely shifts on its axis. 4 months. It is no longer just some abstract number floating in his head. It is a living, breathing reality pressing right against his frozen palm. She is out here carrying his child in the dead of winter, entirely outside of his suffocating control. For a man who needs to play God with the lives around him, there is no greater terror than realizing he is utterly powerless. The muscles in his jaw lock tight as a dark, violent rage begins to boil up inside his chest. "How long?" he demands. The deep, lethal drop in his voice forces the men behind him to absolutely freeze. How long has she been lying here like this? It is a stark lesson for all of us. True power is not about ruthlessly controlling people, but having the humility to care for them before it is too late. "We got the call from a watcher 10 minutes ago," Marco stammers out. "He said she just collapsed." There was a slight hesitation before he made the call. At that word, Dante goes totally rigid. He slowly stands up, locking onto Marco with the cold, dead eyes of a predator ready to strike. Hesitation. In his brutal underworld, a delayed phone call is an unforgivable sin paid for with blood. Marco takes a shaky breath, knowing he is walking on ice. "You told them to just watch her." The orders were strict. Do not step in unless someone attacks her. A heavy, suffocating silence falls over the frozen street. It proves how our own rigid rules often blind us to the actual harm we cause. Dante locked her out of his life to keep her safe, but his blind arrogance nearly killed her right there on the frozen concrete. Seeing her lying broken on the pavement finally shatters his massive ego. His distance hadn't acted as a shield at all. His absence had actually built the very trap that was starving her to death. He squeezes her freezing fingers, desperately trying to anchor himself as his illusion of being the perfect protector falls to pieces. "Get the car running right now," he orders. His voice is cold, leaving absolutely no room for debate. "We are not taking her to a public hospital." Marco gives a quick, tense nod. Already done. A private clinic, 0 paper trail, no questions asked. Dante slides his heavy arms gently under her back, lifting her off the ice. It leaves us with a very sobering truth. Stubborn pride is completely useless when you are left holding the fragile pieces of a life you broke with your own hands. Welcome back to the late shift. You and I need to look closely at this garage scene because it is completely devastating. Harsh fluorescent lights beat down on Dante as he clutches Elena. You can practically feel the freezing weight of her fading heartbeat pressing into his chest. He pins her limp body against his collarbone. His hands, which only know how to deal out brutal violence, are trembling like leaves in a storm. The only proof she is still here is a ragged breath against his neck. "Stay with me," he whispers. He carries her to the car, moving rigid as a corpse, but inside, the terrifying boss is shattering. It is a painful reminder for us all. The massive steel walls we build to keep the pain away usually just trap us inside with it. The heavy door slams, locking them in the dark, where he cradles her against the cold night. The dead silence inside the speeding car makes the hammering of his heart sound deafening. His shaking hand drifts down to her stomach, desperately searching for the unborn life he failed to guard. "Drive," he barks. Tires scream against the asphalt as the vehicle launches forward. Flashing streetlights wash over his tense face, revealing the terrifying, obsessive way he stares at Elena. He studies her hollowed cheeks, agonizing over the life draining out of her. His thumb finds her thin wrist, pressing for a pulse. Normally, that faint beat means hope. But twisted love is a truly dangerous thing. When you treat affection like absolute ownership, you only end up destroying the very person you want to hold. A dark hunger for bloody revenge is taking deep root inside Dante right now. What wakes up inside him right now is far darker than normal human grief. The camera pulls in tight on his face, exposing the cold, terrifying math running behind his eyes. Every passing second makes the brutal truth heavier. Somebody else let this happen. Someone allowed his ultimate prize to rot away to the edge of death while he was occupied. This brings us to a harsh reality check. Real love means giving up your desperate need to control everything. Forcing a person into a locked cage will always break their spirit, no matter how much you claim to care. Dante cannot see that truth. He turns his icy stare toward the black window, and his reflection looks like a hollow mask of pure hate. "Marco," he says softly, his voice completely empty of emotion. "Find out exactly who was on watch tonight. Let us unpack this moment together, because it captures a broken boss backed into a dark corner." Watch how the camera frames his reaction to this brutal twist. His hand clamps down harder on Elena. He is not holding her out of gentle care, but out of raw, toxic ownership. To a man like him, she is simply a valuable item he owns. "Do not bring me excuses," he snaps, his voice dropping to the dead tone of a hunting predator. The car tears through the city toward a secret underground clinic, proving how he hides his violent life away from society. It is tragic how an obsession with absolute power always leaves a person completely powerless in the end. For Dante, this mistake by his guards is an unforgivable betrayal. And for a ruthless mobster, betrayal only means one thing: pure, bloody war. The scene flips to the underground clinic. It is a quiet, sterile space that perfectly mirrors his controlling mind. Bright light hits cold steel, built for total lockdown. Heavy doors slide open, feeding his sick delusion that he literally commands life and death. Striding down the bare hallway, he ignores his surroundings. He grips Elena to his chest like she is his own missing lung. Terrified nurses scramble into the frame in a panic. Dante screams out for her vitals, his voice cracking through the air like a whip. The head doctor begs to put her on a bed, but the boss refuses to let go. Here is the painful truth. Real safety comes from trust, not brute force. Yet he holds her tight, trying to squeeze survival back into her failing body by pure willpower. Notice the painful stretched out pause in this shot. Dante locks his dead eyes onto the head doctor, silently deciding if this man is allowed to touch his property. The doctor mentions severe starvation, keeping his voice soft to avoid triggering a violent meltdown. Very slowly, Dante lowers her onto the bright white sheets. The lens catches the sad, heavy way he moves. His shaking fingers drag across her pale skin for a second too long. Letting go of the people we care about, even to save them, is often the absolute hardest thing we ever have to do. For Dante, giving up control feels like tearing off his own skin. He steps behind the rolling bed, and the terrified nurses instinctively part out of his way, like dry grass bowing before a massive storm. The steady beep of the hospital machines takes over the room, creating a fragile rhythm of a life barely hanging on. Wires snake across her skin, tracking the massive physical damage his paranoia caused. Dante stands stiff at the foot of the bed, washed in the cold blue glow of the monitors. He stares at the dropping numbers not with normal sadness, but like a cartel boss reviewing stolen cash. Her pulse is horribly weak. Then, the doctor drops a massive bomb. She is 4 months pregnant. Dante goes entirely rigid. To a broken villain like him, a baby is just a piece of his dark empire passing down. The selfish need to leave a legacy will ruin us if we forget to care for the people breathing right beside us. He shoves his grief deep down into his chest, leaving nothing behind but pure, cold rage. Look closely behind those dead eyes. You can see Dante doing the dark math on the timeline. The avoided calls, the suspiciously quiet days, all the desperate ways she tried to escape his suffocating grip. The doctor stammers out frantic orders for emergency scans, warning that her broken body might fully shut down. The camera pushes in on Dante, painfully slow. He steps up to the mattress, staring down at Alina's bruised face with a terrifying intensity. "You save both," he whispers. It almost sounds like a desperate prayer, but the sharp killer edge in his tone makes it a deadly Mafia promise. He tosses out medical logic, replacing it with his own twisted rules. Trying to force life to bend to your exact will only blind you to the massive harm you cause. The room erupts into a fast, sweaty medical panic. Pay close attention to how the boss is framed right here. Dante completely ignores the waiting chair. He stands perfectly still, looking like a stone statue carved out of pure, cold vengeance. His mind only knows how to process emotional pain by turning it into a violent power trip, skipping over basic human empathy. True healing always asks us to be vulnerable, but Dante views any emotional wound as a fatal weakness that will get him killed. Marco steps into the harsh clinic light, whispering that the steel doors are fully locked down. Dante lets a horrible, suffocating silence hang in the air. It is a classic mob intimidation tactic. Finally, he slowly turns his head and asks about the guard on duty. Marco flinches. Dante says he will personally do the questioning. His tight jaw promises an absolute bloodbath. That tiny twitch in his jaw is the only warning we get before the storm breaks. He quietly tells his right-hand man that he should already know if the captive is lying to save his skin. Marco looks down at the floor, sweating bullets, and points out a tiny hole in the guard's story. In Dante's lockdown mob world, even a small white lie is an act of unforgivable war. It is tragic how demanding absolute perfection from everyone around you practically guarantees you will end up dying completely alone. He turns his heavy eyes back to Alina, tracking the wild green lines jumping on the heart monitor. Marco nervously explains that the guard thought he was just following strict orders, watching her fade away because no enemies broke in. Dante's face goes totally dark. He gently touches her freezing arm. Under his heavy fingers, her fragile heartbeat feels like a tiny, dying bird. Dante speaks to the empty room, quietly stating that he never gave those fatal orders. His voice drops into a flat, dead register, losing the panic and settling into a cold, terrifying hunting focus. Listen closely to the words he drops next. I do not leave what belongs to me unprotected. That sentence is the ultimate red flag of a poisoned mind. He sees her as a rare, stolen painting to be guarded, not a living woman to be cherished. Holding on to love way too tightly just turns a home into a miserable prison for everyone inside. Marco stays frozen, beaten down by this scary reality. The lead doctor steps nervously back into the frame, wiping cold sweat off his forehead, and softly admits they managed to pause the organ failure. For now, the exhausted doctor stumbles over his terrified words, officially confirming there is a tiny second heartbeat. He warns the crime boss that both the mother and the unborn baby are balancing on a deadly razor edge. But a ruthless guy like Dante simply refuses to acknowledge weakness. He steps up to the mattress, his shaking hand floating just inches above her pale cheek without making physical contact. Fix it, he orders softly, his words dropping like a heavy executioner's axe in a quiet room. The doctor nervously promises to do his absolute best. This makes Dante's deep, controlling sickness flare right up into the open. He glares right through the terrified man. That is not what I said, he hisses. Real strength is learning to accept the painful things we cannot change. But Dante expects the world to obey his every command. Welcome back to the late hours. Let us step into the heavy, suffocating air of that hospital room together. Look at Dante standing there, a man watching his empire bleed out. This was no random tragedy. It was a razor-sharp strike at his heart. His knuckles are completely white, gripping the steel bedrail so hard you can almost hear the metal groan. A lesser man would be weeping on his knees. But Dante bypasses the grief entirely, locking into a terrifying, cold-blooded hunger for vengeance. It reminds us of a hard truth, does it not? When you swallow your agony and refuse to bleed, that pain does not just disappear. It rots inside you, mutating into a toxic fire that eventually burns everyone foolish enough to stand close. The air in the rooms is freezing over just from his stare. Without even turning his head, Dante quietly orders his top enforcer, Marco, to halt the executions. Marco just nods odds, assuming this is standard mob procedure. But look closely at what Dante does next. His trembling hand reaches down, gently brushing against Alina's freezing, pale fingers. The ruthless Don suddenly needs a physical anchor because the foundation of his ego has completely collapsed. He needs to perfectly map out this betrayal before he drowns the city in fire. The steady beep of the heart monitor is the only thing keeping him sane. Sometimes, it takes a brutal betrayal to show us what really matters, right before we have to burn our entire world to the ground just to keep it safe. He remains frozen at her bedside, terrified that if he looks away, she might slip away again. But then, the view shifts to her side of the darkness. Waking up from a trauma like that is a violent shock. The sharp rhythm of the machines drills directly into Alina's skull. She slowly realizes she is no longer lying on the freezing pavement, but buried under hospital blankets. The air tastes like bleach, but beneath it, she catches the heavy, unmistakable scent of Dante's cologne. Her exhausted brain immediately tries to reject the smell. It is a quiet tragedy how our minds work in survival mode. We instinctively build massive walls to block out the things that hurt us most, simply because our hearts are far too broken to handle the bitter truth. Alina desperately tries to shift her weight, but her body is practically made of stone. A soft, involuntary groan escapes her lips, and the monitor spikes betraying the fact that she is awake. Heavy, calculated footsteps slowly approach the bed. Then he drops a single word into the silence. Easy. That one syllable cuts straight through her heavy brain fog. You can literally feel the pure terror locking up her joints before she even finds the courage to open her eyes. She is praying to God that this is just a fever dream, not her ruthless ex-husband standing over her. It is a devastating cycle, honestly. We so often cling to the very person causing our deepest nightmares, using them as a twisted safety blanket in the utter darkness. Her heavy eyelids finally flutter open, but the suffocating dread does not fade. The harsh lights make everything look hollow, and then she sees him. Dante is towering over her fragile frame, his jaw clamped so tight the bone might crack under the pressure. He is not looking at her with the soft relief of a worried husband. No, he is giving her the dead, paranoid stare of a king who just found his stolen treasure. The silence stretches out heavy and suffocating. "You should not be here," she whispers. Her voice is a wrecked, exhausted rasp with absolutely zero fight left in it. The real tragedy in life rarely comes from loud, fiery explosions. It comes in that quiet, gut-wrenching moment you finally realize your personal nightmare is nowhere near being finished. Dante answers with a flat tone, but you can feel the dangerous energy boiling right beneath his skin. Running on pure instinct, Alina's shaking hand drops immediately to her stomach. It is that desperate maternal urge trying to shield her unborn child from this walking disaster of a man. "How long?" She chokes out, her chest heaving. 4 months. Dante fires back, his dark eyes never blinking. "You are certain?" she mumbles, clinging to a fragile hope that he got it wrong. "I do not deal in uncertainty," he snaps. And there it is, his ultimate tragic flaw. He truly believes he can micromanage the entire world. But the hardest lesson we ever learn is that you cannot control everything. The real substance of human life is always found in the messy, unpredictable chaos. You and I both know how this man operates. Even their divorce was handled like a cold corporate merger. He just deleted her from his life like a corrupted file. She stares up at him now, dropping a painfully fragile accusation. "Then you should have known," she breathes out. In that exact second, Dante's broad shoulders twitch. He is using every ounce of his willpower to keep his mask from slipping. "I should have," he admits, and those words hit like a freight train. Alina lets out a hollow sigh. "I tried to tell you," she whispers. "You can sweep someone's pain under the rug all you want, but burying the truth never fixes a thing. Those ignored words will always dig their way out of the dark to shatter your peace when you least expect it." She desperately lists the humiliating ways she tried to reach him. "I called your office," she cries out. "I went to the restaurant, sent emails, camped outside." Exhausted, she swallows her pride and whispers that it does not matter anymore. But Dante snaps back instantly. "It matters." She glares up at him, fighting his toxic pull. "Does it?" she asks, reminding him his choices were final. Dante steps closer, weaponizing his massive frame until the room feels entirely airless. "I gave specific orders," he growls, his voice dangerously low. "You were supposed to be protected." Alina just lets out a dry, defeated laugh. When you become so arrogant that you place blind faith in your own authority, you leave your life completely wide open to the brutal chaos of betrayal. "Protected, Aid," she echoes, a wave of pure disgust twisting her tired features. "I have been freezing in a tiny apartment, pulling double shifts to stay alive, starving for days." She grips her stomach tightly. This is the exact shattering moment the boss realizes his untouchable Mafia kingdom is a total fraud. "That is not what I ordered," he mutters, Visibly shaken to his core, Elena stares at him with a completely detached, numb expression. Then, maybe your commands are not as powerful as you think, she whispers. The heavy silence that follows is absolutely deafening. He just got completely humbled. True power is never about shouting the loudest orders from a high tower. It only exists if your people actually respect you enough to follow through when your back is turned. Dante turns his back, aggressively rubbing his jaw. You can practically see the dark gears grinding in his head as he realizes a rat poisoned his perfect machine. When he turns back, the worried ex-husband is gone. He is straight up the Grim Reaper. "Who stopped you?" he demands. His voice is a quiet whisper, carrying a terrifying promise of murder. Alina starts trembling, struggling to pull the memory through her exhaustion. "A security guy," she stammers out. "He had a scar on his cheek. He said you would hit me with a restraining order if I ever showed up again." The temperature in the room plummets. Here is a brutal reality check. When you build massive steel walls to keep the outside world away, you might just be locking yourself inside with the absolute deadliest snake. Stick with me here, because this changes everything. Dante stands over the bed like a loaded weapon. The dark look in his eyes sends Alina into a panic. "Did you tell him to say that?" she begs, her twisted attachment breaking. Dante drops one brutal, heavy word. No. In an instant, her entire terrifying reality crumbles. Her exhausted brain scrambles to make sense of the lie. "Then why?" she cries out. "Because someone wanted you entirely cut off," Dante replies, the air freezing around him. Isolated and invisible, her trembling hand fiercely protects her baby bump. "Why?" she whispers. "It is a devastating lesson. The absolute worst damage in life rarely comes from your open rivals. It almost always comes from the fake friends smiling right next to you inside your own inner circle. Because you are carrying something they cannot afford to let exist." Dante's gaze drops to her stomach, delivering the heaviest death sentence imaginable. The sad romance is over. This is now a full-blown declaration of war. The scene abruptly cuts away to a rotting, abandoned warehouse down by the Black River. A single, blinding white bulb slashes through the darkness, casting long, psychotic shadows against the rusted walls. The entire place reeks of cheap motor oil, damp decay, and raw human panic. It is about to get unbearably ugly. This is exactly what happens when a broken man makes revenge his sole purpose for breathing. When blind vengeance becomes your only religion. The dark temples you construct to worship in will always be built out of pure, unending agony. Step into this freezing concrete room with me just for a moment. Feel that sudden drop in the air. The heavy metal door swings shut, and Dante steps inside. The guards stiffen, because the apex predator of the city just arrived. In the center of the floor sits Tommaso, strapped tight to a rusted chair, battered and gasping for breath. But Dante is not here to throw wild punches like some desperate street thug. This is surgical. He wants Tommaso wide awake for the agonizing descent into the dark. It brings us to a harsh, cold truth we must all face in this life. True cruelty does not care about leaving bruises on your skin. The most dangerous souls will meticulously dismantle your mind first, ensuring you feel every single millimeter of the fall before you finally hit the ground. Picture Marco, standing quietly beneath a sickly, flickering basement light. His sleeves are rolled up, knuckles bruised, his face completely empty. He tells Dante the prisoner has been cooperating, but the words dissolve into the damp air. Dante offers absolutely nothing in return. He glides forward like a shadow, stalking its prey, stopping mere inches from his target. No screaming, no raging. Dante simply lets a suffocating, dead silence press down on Tommaso's soul. The broken man trembles violently, panting as he stares into the bottomless void of Dante's eyes. It reminds us of a heavy truth we all eventually learn. You never need to raise your voice to win a war. Sometimes, a total, icy silence is the most devastating weapon you can ever wield against another human being. You can see the precise second Tommaso's mind shatters into pieces. His desperate eyes lock onto the boss, and the sheer terror is deafening. He begins to panic, his voice violently cracking as he begs for a chance to explain. Dante just tilts his head, studying him like a scientist examining a tragic, fragile insect. Explain what? Dante whispers, his voice dripping with slow-acting venom. He asks how the woman he once loved ended up starving in the cold, and how his unborn child was left completely defenseless in a brutal world. Tommaso sweats through his torn shirt, stammering that this was never the intention. It is tragic what pure terror can do. Never forget this reality. When your basic survival hangs by a frayed thread, desperation will strip away your dignity before you even realize it is gone. Tommaso is openly weeping now, his chest heaving as he claims the instructions were changed at the very last minute. Dante narrows his dark eyes just a fraction, but that tiny movement plunges the room into an absolute deep freeze. Changed how? Tommaso completely unravels, sobbing that he was told to sever all her connections and erase her from the map, believing it was what Dante secretly wanted. Dante lets out a low, hollow laugh that holds absolutely zero warmth. "And you bought that?" he asks softly. Tommaso freezes, the crushing weight of his mistake settling into his bones. Dante steps closer, suffocating the space between them. Let this be a lesson for all of us. Blindly following whispers without asking the hard questions is the fastest way to betray the people who trust you the absolute most. "I do not pay you to guess," Dante murmurs, his tone sharp enough to carve stone. "I pay you to do exactly what I tell you." Tommaso chokes on his own frantic breaths, swearing blindly that he did. Dante cuts him down in a heartbeat. "No, you listened to somebody else." The silence in that suffocating basement grows so heavy, it threatens to crack the concrete. Let us pause and look closely at this exact moment together. Beneath all that weeping, Tommaso is shielding a deadly secret, and Dante feels the vibration of that lie instantly. He demands a name. When Tommaso tries playing the fool, Dante's hand snaps out, gripping his jaw with a lethal force. Life comes at us fast when we get lazy. Taking the easy way out and trusting shady information is a guaranteed one-way ticket to your absolute ruin. There is an overwhelming, quiet arrogance radiating from Dante right now. He speaks in a delicate whisper, yet carries the weight of a man who dictates who lives and dies. "You let her starve," he says, masking his deep agony over Alina and their child with cold detachment. Tommaso thrashes against his metal constraints, weeping and begging, swearing the command came from the very top. But in the dark math of the underworld, excuses are just another flavor of treason. The cornered man shatters, realizing his apologies are falling on completely deaf ears. It is a brutal awakening. The second you abandon your personal integrity to appease someone higher up, you become the only one left, standing in the flames when the whole house inevitably burns to the ground. "Higher than me?" Dante asks. A strange, twisted spark of curiosity flickers in his dark eyes. For a man who literally holds the entire city by its throat, the mere suggestion of someone pulling rank is genuinely amusing to him. Tommaso freezes in the chair, and in that one agonizing heartbeat, Dante pulls the ugly truth right out of him. The broken man finally spits it out. The Russo family, That cursed name hangs in the damp air like toxic smoke. Marco instantly drops his hand to his weapon, ready to unleash hell. But Dante? He does not even blink. He stands rooted to the floor like a monument of ice. The truth is, the real world always operates in this exact way. The people with the power to truly ruin your life do not throw tantrums. They stay perfectly still, measure the damage, and wait to strike. Hearing that rival name echo in the basement is not about losing territory for Dante. This is a profound, deeply personal violation. His mind connects the twisted puzzle pieces in a fraction of a second. The forged orders, the drained bank accounts, the shattered cell phones. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. They wanted to force Alina into a hopeless, terrifying corner until she had nothing left to hold on to. We often forget this reality when fighting our own private wars. The most devastating attacks are rarely the loud, explosive ones. True power is found in quietly rotting away your rival's foundation until they simply cave in. They wanted to drag his one beautiful weakness into the cruel light. They did not just want her gone, Dante whispers, fully stepping into the dark. Marco gives a slow, grim nod, absorbing the sheer darkness of the situation. Targeting a woman when she is vulnerable and alone is the ultimate act of cowardice in their brutal world. Dante's thoughts violently pivot to his unborn child. This was a targeted strike against his legacy, and absolutely no one disrespects his bloodline and lives to see the dawn. Bound to the cold steel, Tommaso shakes like a dying leaf, desperately begging for one more chance. He cries that he believed it was a simple job to keep her hidden. Dante looks down at the broken man, his face an empty, emotionless mask. "You did not need to know," he whispers softly. "It is a heavy, bitter pill we must all eventually swallow in life. Feigning ignorance will never save you from the massive wreckage you actively helped build." Tommaso stops struggling entirely. You can feel the exact chilling moment the hope leaves his eyes as he realizes he has punched a one-way ticket to the grave. The basement suddenly feels as cold as a morgue. Dante simply turns back, dismissing the man as if he is already buried in the dirt. His only concern now is the staggering arrogance of someone touching what is his. Marco steps up, the faithful shadow, asking how to handle the disposal. Dante does not even pause his slow walk to the exit. "Let the streets know what happens when you mess with my blood," he commands, his baritone voice terrifyingly flat. He kicks open the heavy steel door into the freezing night. Always remember this. The absolute worst monsters do not scream in your face. They destroy you with a quiet, unstoppable certainty. And Marco, Dante calls out over his shoulder, letting that heavy, dreadful pause linger in the midnight air. "We are far from done. What began as a simple betrayal has just erupted into an unhinged, scorched earth war. Now, walk with me to a different kind of nightmare. The hospital wing looks less like a clinic and more like a fortress, packed with men in dark suits. Dante stands paralyzed outside the intensive care glass. On the other side lies Alina, tangled in a web of blinking monitors and breathing tubes. She looks heartbreakingly fragile, drained of that fierce fire she always carried. It brings a deeply sad reality check to our own lives. We constantly take our loved ones for granted when they are vibrant and loud, only realizing how much we truly need them when they are quietly slipping away from us. Look closely at Dante in this crushing moment. That unstoppable energy Alina used to bring to the room is completely extinguished. She is pale, floating somewhere between this world and the next. For the very first time, we witness a massive crack in Dante's titanium armor. Real, desperate human panic is finally bleeding through his untouchable boss persona. But a man wired for violence process pure heartbreak. His mind violently rejects the grief, twisting it instantly into a terrifying need for absolute vengeance. Only the slow, steady beep of her monitor stops him from burning the city to ash. She is fighting, and that innocent child is fighting with her. The lesson hidden in this dark hour is profound. No matter how deep the shadows get around us, the human will to simply survive is a beautiful, undeniable miracle. Look at the subtle tension in Dante's jaw tonight. You and I know exactly what that looks like. His mind is tearing itself apart, playing every bad decision on a slow loop. He pushed Elena into the cold, believing that breaking her heart was the only way to keep her breathing. But that is the ultimate tragedy of men who build castles out of shadows. They think isolation acts like armor. Instead, leaving her alone just left the back door wide open for the wolves. Marco steps into the room, his heavy boots silenced by the hospital monitors. He promises the floor is locked down, but fear bleeds through his whisper. It leaves us with a painful truth. The distance we create to protect the ones we love is usually the exact empty space where they end up taking the heaviest hits. Marco swears that nobody gets past the doors without a triple check. The promise just floats in the freezing air, hollow and useless. Dante will not pull his gaze away from the glass, his soul anchored to the fragile shape of the woman he loves. He answers without anger, murmuring that the ghosts already slipped in once. That quiet sentence carries the absolute agony of a man who understands how the underworld breathes. It means the betrayal came from his own table. Marco stays dead, silent. The predators hunting them did not bother kicking down the front gates. They simply found a quiet crack in the foundation and poured their venom right through. It forces us to swallow a bitter pill. The deepest cuts never come from strangers in the dark. They always come from the very hands we willingly invite inside our own homes. Marco finally says the quiet part out loud. He warns that the crew who put Alina in that bed is absolutely coming back to finish the job. Dante barely shifts a muscle. He is like a shadow waiting for the sun to drop. In a whisper colder than winter, he corrects his right-hand man, saying the enemy expects her to bleed out right here. Through the heavy glass, a nurse walks into the dim room. She taps the medical tubes, wearing a mask of total confidence. But Dante catches the tiny tremor in her wrist. He sees her eyes desperately hunting for the exit. We can take a real lesson from that single moment. You can dress a lie up in a clean uniform, but guilt is a heavy weight. No matter how hard we try to hide our dark secrets, our own trembling hands will always give us away in the end. That tiny crack in her fake confidence only lasts half a heartbeat, but Dante sees right through it. Without pulling his eyes from the window, he demands to know her name. Marco quietly explains she is just part of the new shift, fully vetted by the hospital board. Dante does not blink, but the hallway feels incredibly heavy. He orders Marco to fetch her file immediately. Marco takes off down the corridor, flashing signals to men who would gladly die for their boss. Inside that fragile room, the imposter finishes adjusting the lethal drip. Dante watches her every breath, entirely still. It brings up a quiet rule of survival we all need to remember. The real warnings in life never come with blazing sirens. The deadliest threats hide quietly in the everyday details we usually refuse to look at. Let us sit with this scene for a moment. Watch how this imposter operates under the neon lights. Her trembling fingers hover over Alina's IV line just a fraction too long. Notice how she refuses to look down at the helpless woman beneath her. Her entire frame leans toward the exit, her soul practically begging to run. In Dante's unforgiving reality, those tiny slips equal a signed confession. The heavy silence drags on until Marco hurries back to his side. He leans in and whispers that she is a ghost. 0 records. Dante slowly turns his head, and the heartbreak of a grieving husband vanishes into the dark. The ruthless king is back. It leaves us with a chilling reminder. True danger never kicks down the door screaming. It walks softly into your sanctuary, wearing a perfectly calm smile. Then she has no business being in my hospital, Dante murmurs, his voice stripped of all warmth. Through the glass, the imposter grips the door handle, desperate to vanish into the night. Time seems to stretch, pulling the promise of violence into one agonizingly slow breath. Stop her, Dante commands. The words are barely a whisper. You see, a man who holds true power never needs to raise his voice. Marco is already in motion. The door swings open as 2 enforcers step from the shadows, blocking her path with crushing speed. The woman freezes in her tracks. Her clinical disguise shatters, leaving behind nothing but pure, raw panic. It reveals a brutal truth about life. You can spend a lifetime building a flawless disguise, but sudden pressure will always rip that mask completely away. Look closely at what is really happening here. The terror melting the assassin's face is not about going to prison. It is the suffocating dread of failing the unseen monsters holding her leash. She darts a glance at the patient, then back to the poison. Do not touch a single thing, Dante warns, stepping over the threshold. The gravity of the room shifts the second his boots hit the floor. The steady beep of the monitor echoes like a ticking bomb. This was supposed to be a quiet, invisible kill. The cornered woman tries to speak, but her breath catches as Dante's dead eyes lock onto hers. Who sent you? He asks, completely hollow. Here is a lesson we all need to learn. Real authority never barks or throws wild tantrums. It just stands in the shadows, perfectly and terrifyingly still. She meets his question with suffocating silence, but biology always betrays a liar. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of raw recognition flashes through her pupils. She is far more terrified of the shadow brokers who sent her than the man standing in front of her. In that silence, the devastating truth hits Dante. This was never a random strike against his wife. This betrayal is buried deep within the roots of his own bloodline. Rather than exploding, his expression simply dies. Cold logic takes the wheel. His untouchable empire is rotting from the inside. Every doctor, every guard is now a threat. It is a heartbreaking lesson on trust. The massive fortresses we build to keep the world out mean absolutely nothing if we have already given our monsters the keys to the front door. He steps deeper into the sterile room without a single flinch. His enforcers instantly melt into formation, moving like silent wolves backing their alpha. On the bed, Alina simply sleeps. She is entirely unaware that she was only seconds away from her heart, stopping forever. The cornered killer opens her mouth, scrambling to weave a believable lie, but the crushing darkness in Dante's eyes burns the words right out of her throat. She is just a pawn, slipped past the iron gates by traitors who orchestrated every breath of this hit. It brings us face to face with a painful reality. The most catastrophic damage we suffer in this life rarely looks like a drawn blade. It almost always approaches us wearing a warm disguise and a perfectly practiced, deeply sympathetic smile. Marco's expression hardens into granite, mirroring the absolute frost rolling off Dante. Without waiting for a command, he secures the entire wing, severing all communication to the streets below to you. There are no loud alarms, just a suffocating drop in the air pressure. Stick with me on this part because this is where a desperate man is truly exposed. Dante's eyes trace the plastic IV line, silently reverse engineering how they meant to steal Alina away. He spots the lethal dose resting in the tube, mere inches from her vein. He processes the scene like a machine, scrubbed clean of all human mercy. It reveals a dark truth about trauma. When life violently shoves us over the edge, our hearts stop weeping, and our minds instantly start calculating how to outlast the brutal storm. The specifics do not even register for him right now. His enemies stalked his movements, located his only vulnerability, and orchestrated this knife in the back. They fully expected his wife to quietly slip into the dark, but they catastrophically underestimated the terrifying depth of Dante's devotion. Clear the medicine line, he instructs, his tone soft and undeniably lethal. That single sentence is a signed death warrant. A guard immediately vanishes to find a physician they can actually trust. Look at the cornered imposter now. Her chest heaves, struggling to pull in air. Dante observes her meltdown with cold detachment as her professional mask completely rots away. True loyalty is incredibly rare. When you find a soul worth fighting for, you protect them against a world designed to break you. You and I can see exactly what is unfolding here. The violent trembling in her hands has absolutely nothing to do with Dante. It is the crushing dread of failing the unseen puppeteers pulling her strings. Who gave you the clearance? Dante asks one more time. His voice is hollow, stripped of all human feeling. He is constructing a psychological prison around her, brick by brick. Her silence is not some noble act of bravery. It is just desperate survival math, weighing the fatal cost of speaking against the devil standing right in front of her. Marco steps back into the room, holding a tablet glowing with stolen hospital records. It drops a heavy lesson in our laps. The most agonizing chains we drag through life are the unseen favors we foolishly accept from the worst possible people. Listen closely to me tonight, because we are stepping into a nightmare that Dante never saw coming. The cold blue light of the security monitors washes over his face, and for the first time, the untouchable boss looks utterly terrified. For 2 hours, 3 shadows have been walking right through his restricted doors, carrying fake badges and deadly intentions. Dante is no fool. He knows this is not a random strike, but a complete erasure of his entire empire. The hospital he bought to keep his loved ones safe has been turned into a graveyard. He screams at his men, demanding to know where the real doctors went, but his gut already knows the sick truth. They have been erased from the cameras. It reminds us of a hard truth. The places we build to keep out the monsters are often the exact cages where they trap us. He stands in the dim hospital room, wrapped in shadows, looking every inch the ruthless killer he was born to be. He locks his dark eyes onto the captive, refusing to blink. But she just stares right back, completely hollow, unafraid. The invisible enemy pulling the strings understands Dante perfectly, using his suffocating paranoia to tear his mind apart. It teaches us a heavy lesson about betrayal. The knives that cut the deepest always come from the hands we let closest to our hearts. Across the room, a trembling doctor pushes heavy medicine into Alina's fragile veins. On the outside, Dante is a statue carved from ice. Inside, he is entirely falling apart, tracking every single drop in that plastic tube, desperate to feel like he still has some tiny bit of control left. We have all seen strong men break, but the silence in this room is heavy enough to crush bone. The only sound left is the desperate rhythm of Alina's heart monitor, her body stubbornly fighting for one more breath. From the corner, the captive softly whispers that Dante is already too late. A lesser Masson would explode, but Dante lets the venom hang in the cold air. It shows us the tragic truth of holding power. Building a throne out of fear just leaves you totally isolated when the bill comes due. Dante barely moves a muscle, leaning down to whisper two quiet words. Not yet, but the illusion of strength shatters when his right-hand man Marco flinches. Staring at the heavy door, Marco understands the sick reality. The exits are sealed, and the fire is burning all around them. Marco stares at the heavy wooden door, his eyes wide and terrified like a hunted animal. He simply cannot process how their impenetrable fortress fell apart without a single shot being fired. Dante needs no explanation. He can feel the temperature in the room plummet, tasting the suffocating silence that follows when a king finally loses his crown. It is a harsh lesson we all must face. The idea of permanent safety is just a bedtime story we invent to keep the dark away. And Dante feels the steel jaws of the trap snapping shut, right as Marco's radio erupts into violent static. Out in the hallway, his elite enforcers abandon their posts, running blind in total chaos. The legend of the untouchable boss has officially bled to death. He is completely exposed, wounded by an enemy he cannot even see. For the very first time, the thick mental armor protecting Dante begins to splinter. His impenetrable walls have turned to grey dust. He is no longer fighting off a storm. He is drowning at the bottom of the ocean. Marco inches closer, his voice trembling so hard he might collapse. He whispers that they found a guard dead in the basement, and the body has been cold for a full hour. Dante forces his face to remain blank, but the math is violently tearing him apart inside. An hour means the killer walked right past his entire army. We do this to ourselves all the time. We stare so deeply at the fire in front of us that we never feel the snake wrapping around our ankles. The sheer disrespect of the attack is staggering. The enemy moved through the shadows, while the great boss was entirely focused on the wrong ghost. Watch his eyes carefully. You can witness the exact second the horrible truth settles into his bones. This is no simple break-in. A parasite is crawling through the very walls of his hospital. He looks down at Alina, bathed in the blue glow of the monitors, and a heavy door slams shut in his mind. The fraction of humanity he held onto evaporates. He summons the unfeeling monster from his past to survive the dark. It is a chilling warning to us all. Believing you are untouchable is just building a house of glass and daring the world to throw a stone. Dante commands his men to lock the floor down. His voice sounds like loose dirt hitting a coffin, ordering them to fire at every shadow that breathes. Marco swallows hard, fully realizing they are locked inside their own tomb. Stay with me as we follow him down into the dark. Look at the trembling hands of his top enforcers. Their knuckles are bone white against their weapons, cold sweat dripping from their chins. That is the primal fear of prey realizing they are hunted. Dante pulls away from Alina's bed, cutting the emotional cord. In his damaged mind, saving her life is no longer about love. It is about refusing to lose the war. The sterile hospital gives way to a decaying underworld in the basement. It is a rusted maze of iron and deep shadows. A single bulb flickers above them, casting a sickly yellow decay. Dante tightens his jaw. He knows the bitter truth of survival. When the lights start failing and your vision blurs, the predator is already breathing right next to you in the pitch black. Every step into this basement feels like a carefully designed psychological torture chamber. The assassin left the dead guard exactly where Dante's men would stumble over him. The heavy steel security door has been torn open like paper. The most terrifying detail is the dead man's uniform. It is spotless, proving the phantom who killed him moved with silent perfection. It leaves us with a chilling realization. The most dangerous threats in your life are never the ones screaming in your face, but the quiet ones standing behind your back. Dante kneels beside the corpse, letting his expensive coat drag in the filthy water. He feels no pity for the dead soldier. He just stares at the violent angle of the broken neck. The unseen enemy is slowly shattering his entire ego before ever stepping into the light. The narrow concrete hall gives way to a massive cavern of roaring generators and thick pipes. Dante stops walking, his dark eyes widening as he whispers to himself. The horrific design finally makes sense. This phantom did not come here just to put a bullet in Alina. Marco loses all the color in his face, paralyzed by the trap they blindly walked into. The enemy is forcing the boss into an agonizing corner. Upstairs, the love of his life needs electricity to keep her lungs moving. Down here, the main power grid sits pleats. It proves a devastating point. You can build walls 100 feet high to protect your heart, but it means nothing if the foundation rots away. The killer refuses to grant Dante a quick death. They are slowly burning his soul to ash, weaponizing his very own love against him. A sadistic architect hides just out of sight, pulling the strings and making Dante dance like a broken puppet. It is the absolute destruction of a tyrant's ego. Then, a sharp metallic click slices right through the deafening hum of the generators. Dante freezes in place. He does not flinch, but his mind instantly registers the shape of that noise. It is not the scrape of a heavy boot. It is the cold, rhythmic ticking of a countdown. It makes you realize how fragile we are. We act like we have endless tomorrows to fix the damage we have done, right until the clock suddenly strikes midnight. Dante grinds his teeth together as the air grows violently heavy. The silent stalking phase has ended. The execution is here. He roars a single command, and his men scatter, frantically sweeping their flashlights across the rusty iron tomb. Dante marches directly toward that merciless ticking, moving with the terrifying calm of a man with nothing left to lose. He scans the towering oxygen tanks, acutely aware the hunter could turn any piece of this room into a weapon. They trace the sound to a massive electrical panel on the wall. Marco rips the steel door off its hinges, and the breath leaves every man in the room. It is not a bundle of explosive wire. For a man who demands total control, it is infinitely worse. A small computer sits plugged directly into the central grid. Lines of green code bleed down the screen, silently infecting the life support systems. It proves that the quietest problems often bury the tallest giants. This device was never meant to blow the foundation apart. It is a slow, digital venom meant to suffocate the entire hospital. Let's pause right here at the crushing bottom of this man's empire. Dante leans in, the sick green light of the screen reflecting in his exhausted eyes. He traces the code and realizes the sheer cruelty of the design. The power will not fail all at once. The virus is programmed to shut down the machines one bed at a time, and Alina is the very first target. The Phantom is forcing the king to choose between saving his kingdom or his queen. Dante does not scream or draw his weapon. He just stands there, physically breaking under the unbearable weight of his own choices. It is the most painful lesson a person can learn. The worst punishment is never physical torture. It is watching your own blind ego destroy the only thing you ever loved. The ghost in the dark did not just want blood. He wanted to strip the untouchable boss down to absolutely nothing. Dante really believed he could rule the dark without the devil coming to collect. But down in this freezing basement, a single server hums against the iron, holding something far worse than explosives. the virus tearing through the hospital network, is a slow poison. They don't want to just take him out, they want him to choke on his own helplessness, sinking his ruin to the fading rhythm of Alina's heart on the floor above. Marco sounds like a terrified kid as he reports the breach. You can see the tremor in Dante's jaw, the untouchable king cracking wide open. It leaves us with a quiet, bitter truth. The thicker the walls of pride we build to keep the pain out, the more devastating the crash when reality finally decides to break through. Let's step into this moment together, you and I, and feel the heavy weight of this moment. The harsh lights wash out Dante's face, making him look like a hollow ghost in his own crumbling kingdom. Marco stands nearby, his voice cracking as he admits there are no backups to stop the massive system failure. Dante doesn't say a word. His cold eyes lock onto the crawling code, trying to unmask the phantom who set this trap. But beneath that heavy mob boss armor, a raw human panic is bleeding out. This isn't just a street war, it is a surgical strike on his soul. It brings up a profound truth about life. Our deepest wounds rarely come from random strangers. They almost always come from the few people who know exactly where our armor is the absolute weakest. Look at the unnatural stillness in Dante's shoulders. The tension in that room is thick enough to choke on. This ambush is pure psychological warfare, turning his guarded secrets into weapons. Isolating Alina, and the heavy revelation of an unborn child he only learned about today. None of this is random. Marco whispers that the unseen enemy wants him paralyzed, hoping he will make a desperate mistake. Dante's jaw tightens, but the expected explosion of rage never arrives. Instead, he sinks into a chilling, dead calm. They want a reaction, he murmurs, his voice laced with pure ice. In our own lives, blind emotional reactions only turn us into predictable targets. Finding the quiet strength to pause even when everything around us is burning is the only way we survive. Watch the way he moves now. Dante extends a steady hand toward the humming servers. He doesn't lose his mind and rip the hardware from the wall. Instead, he slowly traces the wires, mapping the boundaries of this digital parasite. This trap was designed to make a desperate man act out of pure fear. But Dante shatters the quiet, barking a harsh order to sever all external access. Marco freezes. A total shutdown means surrendering the syndicate's entire network. Years of power gone in an instant. Yet Dante chooses to isolate the venom rather than save his empire. The lesson here sits heavy on the heart. Sometimes to protect the people we love the most, we have to be willing to cut the cord, let our own castles burn, and bravely stand alone in the dark. By creating a closed loop, the hidden predator is instantly rendered blind. Realization sparks in Marco's eyes as the brutal brilliance of the maneuver hits him. Commands echo off the cold concrete, racing ahead of the lethal virus. Dante's men move with desperate speed, severing digital arteries to quarantine the infection. The entire basement holds its breath. The parasite keeps thrashing, completely unaware it is now screaming into an empty void. High above them, Alina's fragile heart monitor flutters, then finally settles into a slow, safe rhythm. It reminds us that true strength is rarely loud or boastful. Real power is found in quiet, unyielding resilience. It is the steady heartbeat that simply endures after the hardest storms of our lives have finally passed. Her fragile life is finally torn from the sadistic grip that nearly stole it. Down below, Dante feels the shift. It isn't joyful release, just a heavy drop in the room's air pressure. The adrenaline flooding his veins starts to fade. But make no mistake, this is not true relief. It is only the hollow delay before grief sets in. Marco whispers that the threat can be wiped clean. Dante gives a single exhausted nod. The final keystrokes fall, and the algorithm collapses into dead data. The silence filling the space is different now. It holds the cold, clinical stillness of a morgue. It reminds us of a painful truth we all must learn. Surviving a deep tragedy never means walking away unscarred. You always carry the ghost of that fear with you, long after the bleeding stops. Let's pause right here, you and I. This moment holds a devastating lesson. Those who obsessively try to control everything are the easiest to manipulate. Dante doesn't relax. His paranoid mind is still turning, dissecting the ruined code to find the architect's true motive. With mechanical dread, he pulls his encrypted phone from his coat. He doesn't speak a single word. There is no need. The psychological bomb has already been planted. Glowing on the cracked screen is a single sentence without a sender. The words hit like a physical punch, a masterstroke of cruelty. She was never the true target. The illusion of absolute control is the most dangerous lie we ever tell ourselves. We build massive fortresses, totally forgetting the wolves might already be inside the gates. Watch closely as the ironclad psyche of a kingpin visibly shatters. The terrifying genius of his enemy's manipulation becomes agonizingly clear. The hospital lockdown, Alina's failing heart, the revelation of a child, all of it was nothing but a sick diversion designed by a masterful psychopath. Dante's face remains a blank canvas, but underneath that cold mask, every wire in his mind is violently snapping. The truth crushes him. He left his deepest vulnerability unprotected while he was busy guarding his own pride. It is a brutal truth we all must eventually face in our own lives. We spend so much exhausting, energy-building, giant walls around the things we already possess that we leave our fragile futures entirely unguarded, just waiting for the wolves to strike. This agonizing chess game was built for one singular purpose. The unseen enemy wanted to violently amputate Dante from his own future. We've seen the dark hearts of men before, and this is a classic predator's strike. They don't just want to draw blood. They want to burn your legacy to ash. Dante suddenly spins with kinetic fury, barking a sharp command to get him backstage immediately. But his wild eyes betray the terrifying truth. His mind is no longer in the medical ward. He knows that far beyond these walls, his true heart sits entirely exposed to an enemy who knows him intimately. It leaves us with a sobering reminder. No matter how obsessively we try to lock the world away, we can never completely shield the people we love from the tragic chaos of life.